Alright, my darlings, and here I am today in a clear sign that I can't be asked to put in the effort to make a full video. So, I'm employing the assistance of another reviewer to help me with talking about something, that being Scribbles to Screen.
Hello there, it's a pleasure to be here.
I bet it is. And it's always good to have someone around with more subscribers than me that I can steal later on.
What?
Nothing. Now let's get on with the show. Scribbles does videos about media that never quite got fully released or is just really obscure, such as the original version of Shrek, Ghostbusters, and of course, Doctor Who. We also did a video on his channel not so long ago, where we recreated a lost scene from the David Jason version of the BFG, where I provide the voice of... well, you can probably guess who. So, what better person to team up with to talk about a period of Doctor Who that has almost lost to the time vortex and remembered by hardcore fans like ourselves? That being the Wilderness Years.
In particular, the production company is known as the BBV.
As I mentioned in the past, the 90s era of Doctor Who is referred to as fans as the Wilderness Years, the era after the cancellation of the original series but before the start of the modern revival series. But despite that, the BBC tried many times to try and revive Doctor Who and bring it back in some way. I've talked about some of these before, such as the unreleased Doctor Who cartoon by Nelvana and the actually released Flash animated series Scream of the Shalka. But the biggest effort during the Wilderness Years, aside from the Doctor Who movie by Fox and the Sci-Fi Channel, were the various homespun specials created by a company known as the BBV.
The BBV stands for Bill and Ben.
Though not these Bill and Ben.
They were a video production company created by Bill Baggs, the Ben being his then wife.
A man who is quite a controversial figure, but to keep the video light, and to avoid a comment tsunami, we're just focusing mainly on his creative pursuits and the results from that.
Bill was a big Doctor Who fan, who created many direct-to-video projects, casting veterans of classic Who, with some projects being original and unrelated to Doctor Who, other specials acquiring a small license to certain characters of the programme, and original monsters and characters that were perhaps a little bit too inspired from the main show, which boarded Bill Baggs into some legal trouble.
BBV is kind of like the Video Brincado or the Asylum of the Doctor Who universe, or those cheap knockoff toys you usually find at Poundland.
Hey, why is that car in my Doctor Who collection?
This is why this media is generally so obscure, because most of it was never actually aired on television and only available through home media releases. And while VHSs were in their prime in the 90s, that was also where it became unstuck, as these productions were really made as a way to fill up gaps in the Doctor Who market for the Whovians to enjoy. In other words, they were pretty much expensive fan films, so I think they can be a little bit of an acquired taste. I mean, it's going to be difficult to convince people to buy something that looks like it was filmed in somebody's back garden and costs you £15.
Also, why would a person buy videos of some old British sci-fi show when they could rent Lethal Weapon from the next shelf over? Or perhaps something from behind the store's velvet curtain?
Huck, please! This is a family show, for Christ's sake! The BBV did a lot of productions that were Doctor Who related and inspired, and talking about them all in detail would take way too long. So we're just going to look at some of our favourite outings by the company.
Oh, before we begin, Scribbles, you wouldn't mind getting into an avatar that's a bit more crossover appropriate.
Oh, I haven't got a cartoon of myself. Hang on, maybe I can try something on my shelf.
Right, let's see, that's it!
Excellent. Now let's begin.
It's not as cute as me, but it'll do.
Probably the BBV's most famous and earliest Doctor Who related outing was the Air Zone solution. Granted, it doesn't really have anything to do with Doctor Who in terms of story, but it does star 4 of the previous actors who played the Doctor, as well as Nicholas Briggs, the current voice of the Daleks and the Cybermen, Nicola Bryant, who was the actress who played Perry in the series, and Bizarrely, of all people, Alan Cummings, professionally Shakespeareanly trained actor and unfortunate bad movie magnate, and would later go on to play the role of King James I in the modern series. And even though the story is unrelated to Doctor Who, though granted even the stuff that they did do that is related to the show is considered non-canon anyway, it does feel like something that you would have seen in the later 80s era of the show, as it takes place in the near future where the pollution of the planet has gotten so bad that the world is on the verge of ending. Take that, Chibnall! These guys were doing heavy-handed environmental stories long before you were. In fact, in this world, the pollution is so bad that if you go outside without wearing a mask over your mouth, you'll die.
Oh wow, they predicted the episode Orphan 44. And the pandemic? Are we sure the BBV didn't actually have a time machine on their hands?
I do like the opening on how it's going for a documentary vibe. It's almost a way to make the whole film feel very grounded, to get a sense of the atmosphere, yeah, no pun intended, of what the world is going through. But then, with Peter Davison throwing at you climate change, technology and politics, it's like you're watching the ending of a political documentary.
Now there's a nice cosy blanket to hide your dirty washing under. That's a definite sign something unpleasant and underhand's going on. Official bullshit from the government!
Without knowing the full context, it's just quite a lot to take in the first several minutes. In fact, that's the best way to describe this whole film. I've got the sense that Bill Baggs wanted to be very ambitious for this project, to have some twists and turns and hard-hitting scenes, but he ended up throwing so much at the audience. Like, only 10 minutes in, Peter Davison comes across a lady on an oxygen machine who he recognises as Rachel. It's like if in the Doctor Who episode of Rose, the first time we meet Mickey, he's like at hospital in a car accident and we get a very emotional scene with him and Rose. Like, you're kind of pulling your emotional cards a little early for the story. Who's Rachel? It feels a lot like a student film where you can certainly appreciate the ambition, but the director is still learning a thing or two about storytelling. And still within the first act we then get a sex scene, like, let's slow down a little bit. Oh god, this is getting too sweaty even for me.
Though if this makes you feel uncomfortable, just wait and see what we've got coming up later. Despite Davison actually getting billed above Colin Baker, and Pertwee himself getting the top billing, despite the fact that he's only in the movie for 3 minutes, Baker is really the main character of this special, playing one of the biggest celebrities in this world, a weatherman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Emily Jones. A Burton on Trent for this wonderful jumper. Just look at it. It'd brighten up any dull day, wouldn't it? Fortunately, I can't wear it because the blue interferes with the chroma key.
I guess the future really is looking poor if a weatherman is the biggest star in the world. Then again, I take that over reality TV stars being worshipped by the public.
After Davison's death, he starts getting psycho messages from him, as well as the ability to see him as a ghost, informing him as to what Airzone is up to. This doesn't quite add up, as Colin has never seen Davison before. So maybe he's actually going insane. Which, based on the way he acted during the time as the Doctor, that wouldn't really be much of a surprise. I'm looking at you, Twin Dilemma, and with the help from McCoy's character, they unearthed the major conspiracy as to what Airzone is up to. Trying to use genetic engineering to make people being able to breathe polluted air rather than the clean air.
I'd say that this is a cutting your nose off to spite your face solution to the problem, but then again, some previous governments in this country have tried to solve certain problems by literally redefining the definition of a word in the dictionary that the problem is associated with, so it won't be considered a problem anymore. So, if I'm honest, I wouldn't actually be surprised if some governments in the far future actually did try doing this as a solution.
Neat idea. Bad image.
Hey, he's got a point. I mean, who'd want to become a bunch of mutant fish people? It'd be a terrible image issue for the human race.
Guess the 10th Doctor wasn't the only one who had vanity issues.
Ah, come on mate, you want to talk? You present the show of cartoons. Of yourself and a talking doggy.
He's a fox, and leave him out of this.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Only joking. Alright, okay. Back to the review. Colin Baker and Nicola Bryan actually do make quite a cute couple. I mean, I kinda wish they introduced their playfulness early on, rather than the first interaction of Colin snatching her bum.
Covering the forearm effect.
like without the knowledge or context of them already being within a relationship. I presume Colin was some creep.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure was all mine.
But putting that aside, they're rather endearing, hopelessly in love with one another, and have adorably found themselves in a comfortable position in life. While later Colin does use his position in a risky way that may burst that comfort bubble, Nicola Bryant is still supportive. That's true love for you, baby. I admire its social commentary, with Colin Baker being a bubbly forecast man. But once he learns the truth of the government's air zone solution, he attempts to use his popularity and position to make people aware, and how his boss later on scorches him for bringing that onto the segment, even though all he did was just state the facts.
I'm amazed that you can't see that this is a big story. Or maybe you don't want to.
Look, I'll decide what's news and what isn't around here, okay?
It's a lot like celebrities in an innocent bubble, trying to bring awareness to a serious issue, and the fanbase finds it rather hard to accept them talking about a rather grey issue. It was definitely much more than I was expecting. Certainly not the best film to discuss the landscape of how insensitive the public is of absorbing media, but hey, it was certainly a message I didn't see coming.
And as I said earlier, it's much better than some of Chris Chibnall's similar efforts as head writer of Doctor Who. Me personally, I think it should have just stayed as a straight post-apocalyptic political drama, but the film gets too obsessed over the fact that the main actors were once Doctor Who actors. Like, why does Peter Davison turn into a ghost after he dies anyway? And why do the other Doctor Who actors feel what he's feeling when he dies and then are able to see him? I mean, Pertwee and McCoy I could kind of justify because they were his friends, but Baker had never met him, like we said. This doesn't make any sense. Oh yeah, speaking of which, John Pertwee is in there. He's like the old, wise, talking man kind of archetype, but he really doesn't do anything. But it is cool to see him there, especially because he was the oldest surviving Doctor actor at the time.
Yeah, that choice was definitely made for Doctor Who fans, so I don't think too many people outside of the Doctor Who fandom will get that much out of it. And even me, as a hardcore Doctor Who nutcase, the novelty of all the Doctor Who actors being together wasn't enough to keep me over. Like I said, this one, only for the Doctor Who nerds.
Agreed, though I can certainly admire the film's ambition, though it is a shame that they couldn't get Tom Baker to be in the movie. To be fair, around this time he was trying to distance himself from the franchise to find work elsewhere, so I can understand why he didn't want to be involved here, even if it wasn't technically Doctor Who related.
For several years, Bilbax was trying to acquire the license for the Cybermen to make its own spin-off movie called Cyber War, which allegedly would have seen the Cybermen fight against the Ice Warriors, but failing to secure the license and funding, he made a semi-Cyberman film called Cyberons, an original creation of a robotic cyborg that first appeared in several BBV audio plays. Oh no, wait a minute, did I call them an original creation? Nah. They were basically Cybermen in everything but name. The so-called Cyberon in the story are just drugs. Just drugs that the main characters take. You do get to briefly see some Cybermen lookalikes, but sadly they're just hallucinations.
To be fair, I get the feeling that a lot of things in the 80s Doctor Who era were created on drugs.
No kidding. I mean, a cosmic circus controlled by a bunch of stone statues named after a kick-ass Marvel movie? What were they on when they came up with that?
You've got a sci-fi story about robot men that's doing everything it can to keep it as cheap as possible. AKA, we barely get to see the robot buggers. And those Cyberon costumes, oh my goodness. Well, they certainly look like the Poundland equivalent of the Cybermen, just like my actual Poundland knockoff.
Actually, I think those look better than the ones from the movie itself, to be honest.
Alright, but just to be fair for a moment, the costumes were created by a fella called Terry Copper, which he's actually made a video about his involvement with the project. I would highly recommend checking it out. He only barely had a budget to make the helmets, which I would say they do look pretty nice, and was asked last minute to make the bodysuits. which explains why they look the way they do in the final film. But here's a little tip for any filmmakers out there: if you're directing a movie where the main bad guys look pretty flimsy, then don't film them in broad daylight in the middle of somebody's sitting room. You're really not doing the costumes any favour by doing so. There is kind of an error of unbelievability when you've got your alien in a familiar and everyday setting. The C-3PO costume looked pretty iconic in the desert, but it would be a bit jarring if you saw him outside your Tesco's. Certainly filming the Cyberons in low lighting conditions would have went a long way to make them look far more intimidating. Given that they don't explain that much about the Cyberons in the film, maybe BBV intentionally left it so vague that when Bill Baggs was on good terms with the BBC, he could later on retcon it to make the Cyberons canon with the Cybermen. If so, he's got a big ego expanding his franchise just like Disney.
That's enough Mickey taking from me and my big transponders.
Cyberon definitely feels more like something from Doctor Who than some of the other efficiently licensed BBV products we'll be talking about. Cheesy effects, silly monsters, hokey acting, and some really silly logic from some of the characters. Well, get off from your chair then! The use of the sort of Cybermen does elevate it above some of the others, in that it doesn't just feel like a community college's first year drama project. So it gives it a bit more of a sense of ambition, but it still feels like a bit of a chore to get through. Though believe me, we'll have some stuff coming up later that you won't be able to take your eyes off of.
No matter how hard you try.
I have to admit my favourite moment is probably the part where 3 of the characters are playing a pub quiz machine. It has nothing to do with the plot, but it is a fun little diversion. Plus the really fake way the actress tries to make it look like she's shaking the machine is hilarious.
This machine is wired up wrong.
By shaking the air around the edge of the frame, it'll look like I'm shaking the machine, right? There are some pillow talk moments and a brief moment where you actually see a guy's bare ass, but still, that's only, no pun intended, bush league to what's coming up next. Though I do have to say, what was with the obsession with weird sex scenes in these BBV productions? Were the people who wrote the scripts all horny sci-fi nerds or something?
You can talk.
Though I will admit, I am disappointed that the film wasn't about a cybernetic version of Ron Swanson. Such a disappointment. Still, I have to give credit to being a solid effort, but still nothing I choose to watch.
Despite how poor the productions of these various specials were, the BBV at the very least did have a sense of humour with themselves, and made one special that was a self-aware knockoff spoof of Doctor Who, which actually stars 7th Doctor himself, Sylvester McCoy, as the equivalent character of the Doctor.
I initially thought the first time I watched this that the BBV had their license pulled by the official Doctor Who holders and they made this as a screw you response to them, but it seems that that isn't technically the case as they were still making home video specials after this came out. Plus it does actually feature a few actually licensed characters from Doctor Who, but then again many of the Doctor Who characters and villains and so forth are owned by individual copyright holders, so it's possible that they still had ownership of some of those licenses but not the main Doctor Who one. Also, a few years prior, Baggs had asked the BBC's permission to produce audio dramas of Doctor Who. This was before Big Finish Productions, you understand. They told him no, but he made them anyway, which resulted in him getting a cease and desist from them. So this could either be a well-intentioned parody or a bit of a stone throwing at BBC's Glass House. Either way, it actually is one of the best things that the BBV actually did with the Doctor Who license.
And all it took was a nice bit of passive-aggressive sniping to make it happen.
Which there has been no shortage of between us in this video here.
Well, round here my sense of humour is a bit like a dropped lemon drizzle cake. It's all bitter and twisted.
Can we get on with this before I leave and start my own channel?
Yes, let's go ahead now.
That cease and desist actually got Bill Baggs banned off working on any other official Doctor Who content, as the BBC didn't want to be associated with somebody they had to legally stop. In simpler terms, Bill Baggs ended ended up crapping in his own bed, divorcing him from the franchise he so dearly loved.
The special opens with a hilariously animated flash sequence involving Rassilon, saying that he requires the services of the greatest Time Lord of all time, but unfortunately he's unavailable, so he's having to make do with hiring the Foot Doctor, played by Sylvester McCoy, whose TARDIS takes the form of a washing machine this time. Probably for the best that not a lot of kids saw this special, because that may have inspired them to climb into washing machines themselves. And as Sonic the Hedgehog once said,
"That's no good."
He then arrives at what is probably Bill Bagg's own house to battle against the Cybermen, the Sontarans, and the Autons.
Opening a new branch of Spudulike, I see.
Oh, more potato head insults. Can't you think of something more original?
Not without descending to matters of the toilet, no.
Though they're about as genuine as those bootlegs that Scribbles has.
Whoa, hey, leave the toys out of this.
You started it.
Oh, that little ginger. Anyway, the special is actually very funny and very well written, helped by the fact that Sylvester McCoy is amazing as always. Hell, he even gets to play the spoons one last time.
Oh no.
It's very self-aware, and the low budget and poor production qualities actually aids in the special's comedy as a whole, both intentionally and unintentionally. Oh, look at that. They're trying to be so cute. Doesn't exactly stop it from being cheap as hell though. Look at that, you can see somebody's holding the helmet with the fingers in the corner.
Also, I do love how this enforces that this is the early 2000s by seeing a Cyberman sitting next to a Pokemon 2000 poster and playing with a PlayStation 1.
I thought Cybermen were all about upgrading themselves to the most modern forms of technology. Why isn't he playing with a PS2 controller?
Well, let's just say that Sony's lack of console stock is not a recent issue, as even back then people struggled to get the latest hardware, so even the Cybermen, a technologically advanced race from the future, probably couldn't get one either.
It's always the small details you gotta love. Quite clearly they filmed it in some young child's bedroom. Either that, or the room of a man-child that's still into weird cartoons.
Oi, I resent that.
Oh, come on, can't I at least make one little cheeky jab back?
Touche.
As much as we've made fun with this low-budget production, to be fair, there are some good sight gags, Looney Tune type of humour, and the writing that captures the spirit of British comedy.
Oh, I can hardly bring myself to say it. You're unlicensed.
Yes, but I still fight evil across the galaxy.
Unlicensed evil?
Ostensibly, yes.
I can easily see some of the jokes being repeated in Monty Python. If those sort of comedies are your cup of tea, then this isn't too bad to check out. It's a shame that the writers of this, Paul Epson and Garrett Preston, didn't get a chance to do more spoof stuff of Doctor Who after this, because it is legitimately really funny. Because I think they were given the free range to do whatever they wanted, experimenting and playing around with sights and gags. Oh well, we've still got this one special though, and as the Jungle Guide would always say in Jungle Run, one is better than none. Given its amateur quality, I was actually quite impressed with the amount of visual effects they were able to pull off. The CGI and especially the masking, particularly near to the very end. Even though the majority of the monsters were quite low budget. I mean, this is just like Chucklevision, but made with more bitterness, and without a budget. Although, to be fair, Chucklevision didn't have much of a budget to begin with, but that's beside the point.
That being said, there are some jokes that they miss, like how the Sontarans in the classic series were always described as being short, yet they were often taller than some of the other actors. Even here that happens. Look, the Sontaran is taller than the Doctor is. That being said, there was one writer who got his start in Doctor Who here and went on to do much bigger things in the franchise, that being Mark Gatiss, who wrote the first 4 entries in what would later be known as the Probe series. And so now we move on to Probe, probably the second most famous thing that the BBV ever did, and we're taking a look at the first entry, the Zero Imperative. I will admit that the opening of the Zero Imperative is legitimately creepy. A sweeping shot through an insane asylum, hearing the sounds of the suffering patients, whilst hearing children singing Daisy Daisy. Although granted, it doesn't quite top this.
Daisy, Daisy.
But still, creepy nonetheless, especially since in 2001 we didn't get shown this after Hal was done singing. I didn't know my granddad was in this movie. The choice of cast in this film does have me a little bit confused though. It is supposed to take place in the same universe as Doctor Who, since the third Doctor's companion Liz Shaw is in there, but other actors from the series like McCoy, Pertwee, Baker, Sophie Aldred and Peter Davison are also in it, but they're all playing different characters than who they played in the show. Granted, the actual show of Doctor Who has never been afraid to have its actors play multiple roles within the same show, in some cases even within the same episode, but this does make you initially think that they're playing their iconic roles, but they're not. Though granted, that ridiculous haircut they gave McCoy does help you believe he's not the 7th Doctor, unless he suddenly had the urge to start mimicking Mel's hairstyle. As expected though, they all do give amazing performances. I especially love the look McCoy gives Baker for the first time they see each other in the movie. It's like he's trying to say to him, "You nearly killed the franchise, you bastard."
If I had to be honest, I had no idea what to expect. But watching this one soon after the Airzone solution, I can confidently say it's certainly a step up. The writing is on par with season 26 of classic Doctor Who.
Youth. Quite wasted on the young. I've always said that. Why did you come here, Peter?
Not for you.
Not for me.
For nobody except myself.
The story has a natural build-up. We know who to follow, it's got a clear beginning, middle and end, and they save a lot of the hard-hitting stuff near towards the end. Unlike Airzone where it had to have a plot twist every 10 minutes. Generally, it's better to save that stuff in the third act, as that kind of reveal is going to be much more rewarding to the audience. And of course the ending is going to be the last thing that anybody remembers from a film, so you want to make it darn memorable. It feels like they learnt a lot from the Airzone solution.
The only one who puts in a surprisingly rather low-key performance is the new one to the scene, Mark Gatiss, which granted he was very fresh to this, but he never shows any of his trademarks as an actor. His transformity, his over-the-top nature, his sinisterness. He's just rather bland, to be honest.
Is that you?
No, it's my brother, Daniel.
And then?
That's my son.
Your son?
Mm-hmm.
I certainly respect Gatiss for being a professional when he was writing and acting in this, but you can clearly tell that he desired more, which thankfully not long after this he and his friends would start the League of Gentlemen, and he'd also get to write some official Doctor Who novels, so I guess he just needed a stepping stone for the rest of his career.
Overall, while a lot of the BBV projects feel like extravagant fan films that are a little bit too ambitious for their own good, this one I can say feels the closest into fitting in line of a professional classic Who production.
While the BBV productions of Doctor Who spin-offs ended around 2004, with the exception of the final Probe story which was released in 2015, one of their productions did get released after the new series had begun, with the movie Zygon, When Being You Is Not Enough. A film that has also become rather infamous for some various reasons.
Oh my days. Oh, I've got a lot to say about this one.
As do I. The film is about a person named Michael Kirkwood, who actually looks a lot like John Sims of all people, so maybe the person he shapeshifted to look like was actually Harold Saxon. Oh, I'm sorry, have I given it away? Yeah, he's actually a Zygon. Yep, he's a Zygon who doesn't actually know that he is one, which is actually quite an interesting idea and would later be used in the Capaldi Zygon two-parter, though thankfully there are elements in this special that didn't transfer over to those episodes, but arguably did in other forms of Doctor Who media.
As with most BBV productions, it has that typical sense of awkwardness and unintentional hilarity stemming from the actors either underacting or trying a wee bit too hard.
He's dreaming, isn't he?
Cheers.
Keep up the good work.
Are you on drugs?
Which, I suppose that makes it more memorable at the end of the day, but it does feel a lot more polished than previous efforts, even if it does feel very homebrewed.
The film is mostly about him and his psychiatrist trying to figure out what is going on with him and also starting a very abrupt relationship. No, seriously, one scene they're talking about going on a date, and then the next scene, this happens. Oh, and they do not leave anything to the imagination here, and it's actually quite shocking, and as a result, we can't show any of it here.
It's not a family show anymore, is it?
Now I know why Scribbles insisted I watch this, though. It's certainly not something you can ignore.
No matter how hard you try. In Zygons, there are far more sex scenes than you actually get to see the alien Zygons. You only get to see the actual Zygon once, and looking at the quality of the face piece, yeah, I can see why. If that was the best they could do for a costume on a low budget, then fair enough. But BBV, you couldn't film the Zygon in a more discreet way where you don't see the flaws of the costume?
Half of it is just sex scenes and nude actors, and it's not shot particularly artsy or delicately, so that combined with the video quality and even the music they use in some scenes, it genuinely feels like I'm watching a Doctor Who porn parody.
And what's so wrong with that?
Because this is supposed to be Doctor Who, not Species. Although, I guess I am glad they didn't go the whole hog and show us the Zygons having sex in their true form.
Again, what's so wrong with that?
I think we need to have a talk once this video's over, Huck. I will admit that the idea of Doctor Who exploring more mature concepts with their aliens and plots could actually have some merit to it, and it could work. But this was not a good example of this, and as I mentioned before, the same kind of tactic would be done again in Torchwood, and it didn't really work great there either, though at least that was a tad more tasteful, and I will give this special credit, it didn't go as far as having an alien that needs orgasmic energy to feed itself, but still, it is rather uncanny how much this film feels like Torchwood.
Zygon is actually a follow-up from Cyberon, as it features the same Doctor character from the first film, Lauren. And I would say overall, in comparison, it is better, as where Cyberons didn't really have any stakes to the story, Zygon does have a build-up. The story has twists and turns and an ongoing threat that chases our characters. The actual Cyberons were just some drug hallucinations, where the climax was in somebody's living room, not really photographed in the most dynamic way. Zygons, there is a constant change in location, there's far more going on, and while yes, you could probably replace the Zygons with any other original alien, it at least sets up on what the Zygons are, and the limit to the expense of their shape-shifting capabilities, and with a little bit of setup and payoff. For what is a low-budget alien invasion story, I think they did the best they could. But I'm still not too sure what to make of the sex scenes. I mean, I understand what they were going for by having some of the actors nude in certain scenes was to show their vulnerability, but there are some certain scenes where it seems like they were being a bit too cheeky for their own good. It's like it was being directed by a really horny teenager. This was the very first BBV production I ever saw. I don't recall liking it on initial viewing, but after all these years later, I would give it a little bit more credit than it deserves.
Either way, this special does definitely have some interesting ideas, but it just feels like they wanted to make something completely different and then just shoved the Doctor Who name onto it to make it more marketable. Which actually, to be honest, that sums up most of what the BBV has done in terms of Doctor Who. In my opinion, while most of the BBV's efforts are rather laughable by today's standards, and even by the standards of the time to be frank, I have to admit that they are rather endearing in the very homespun way, and they're actually somewhat inspirational from a certain point of view. Doctor Who has always had that kind of underdog feel to it, that it was coming from a place of genuosity, and it was just something that the creators wanted to make regardless of how much budget and resources they had. And they just put their all into it, and you can always see the amount of effort that went into it from everybody involved, and even though these turned out to be rather embarrassing in hindsight, they do still capture that same feel about them, and that they are a passion project of the people that made them, and they really put all their effort into it. Even if their productions and the main man behind them was a bit sleazy and egotistic sometimes, and has done some things that I certainly don't agree with, that inner filmmaker in me has to give him props on his determination, and as I said, they're clearly clearly not without their entertainment factors, even if a lot of what makes them entertaining is rather unintentional or just rather sleazy sometimes. But hey, other great entertainment has been lauded as classics for the same reason. Not that I would regard these as classics by any means of the word, but I do feel that they deserve a bit more praise, even if they're not great.
As it currently stands, Bill Bagg is a very controversial figure in the Doctor Who fandom. Countless stories on how he underpaid his workers, promising them compensation later on but never delivering, with several of the main TV Doctor Who actors ceasing working with him after some time. It's generally a shame that there's so much dirty laundry behind these productions, as these productions came from a sincere background of fandom being so desperate to see more of their favourite show. And while many of them I could only truly recommend them for the Doctor Who fanbase, but when you view them from that innocent point of view, there's a lot to admire about them. It's like watching a filmmaker's portfolio from his work during his education days. They're technically flawed, but you admire them for taking on such big ideas. You may laugh, but also applaud on what they were able to achieve along the way. But as shady as the behind the scenes stuff may be, I'm glad that Nicholas Briggs and Mark Gatiss got to go off and work on official BBC Doctor Who. Nearly everybody involved had a happy ending. Well, apart from Bill Baggs. If you want to check out more indie Doctor Who productions, then I would highly recommend on checking out the production Real Time. They've made Doctor Who dramas, an abundance of documentaries, and thankfully the company isn't run by douchebags.
So, any final thoughts, Edward?
Well, it's been certainly fun talking about BBV, but I wish that doggy could stop insulting me.
Oh ho ho, that's it. You want to take this outside?
Outside where?
Anywhere.
Fine.
Well, I never thought I'd actually mean it before now, but I actually have had enough of this and I'm going on the other side to have a bath. Bye!